Good evening, everyone. I'm Marilyn Herron, Director of the Rogers Center for Holocaust Education at Chapman University. Welcome to tonight's program presented by the Rogers Center, which is in the Wilkinson College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at Chapman University. This is the third event in our series, Fragments of Memory, New Lenses on the Holocaust. Tonight, we are pleased to screen the 2022 animated film Charlotta, or Charlotte, and to welcome the film's producer, Julia Rosenberg. The Dean of Wilkinson College, Dr. Jennifer Keene, will moderate a brief conversation with Ms. Rosenberg before the film, and they will return to the stage for a Q&A after the screening. And as far as we know, this is the first time the film has been screened at a university, so we're very proud of that. Charlotte tells the story of German Jewish artist Charlotta Salomon, whose exceptional talent was equaled only by her extraordinary determination to bring her artistic vision to life. Even as Nazi persecution increased, Charlotte kept painting, ultimately creating a truly monumental series of paintings entitled Life or Theater, considered by some to be the first graphic novel, or at least to have contributed to the development of the graphic novel. Charlotte's story is also a powerful reminder that personal and family challenges continued even as the Nazi threat to Jewish life grew greater. Julia Rosenberg is one of Canada's top producers, with a successful career as an executive at Alliance Communications and Serendipity Point Films before launching January Films in 2005, where she has produced award-winning documentaries and features. Charlotte, starring Keira Knightley, is her first animated film. And now please welcome Julia Rosenberg and Jennifer Keene.
So welcome everybody, and welcome Julia to Chapman University. Really excited to see this film and have a chance to ask you questions afterwards. But in a kind of nice change of pace, we thought we might actually prepare the audience by asking a couple of questions ahead of time. So we're going to be up here very short moments, and then we'll be on to the film. Okay. So my question here is, you have had a very successful career as a producer. And had one for some time before Charlotte. You'd never produced an animated film before. And what led you to believe that this story could best be told as an animated film?
I didn't really think about it. I was on a run one morning 12 years ago, and the idea that Charlotte Salomon drew her life story, and so I needed to produce a drawn version of her life story, came into my head. And by the time I got home, I Googled the Charlotte Salomon Foundation, sent an email, then went into the shower and went, what have I done? So I didn't really interrogate the idea, to be honest. Since having the idea, I've seen through the production of it that it's really, really well suited for many reasons, but one of which is the way we sort of bring Charlotte's, some of her paintings to life, as it were. Right. We animate some of them.
I love that. I love that story, because if any of you are runners, you know some of your best ideas come during those moments when you're not trying to think. It just sort of pops into your head. It's great. So as we prepare to watch this film, what do you hope audiences will take away from it?
I just want people to leave the theater and Google Charlotte Salomon and see her work. That's what I hope.
Okay, awesome. All right, I promise we'd be quick, and we are, so thanks so much. We'll be back after the showing of the film to give you an opportunity to ask your questions, and we hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Wow, I think that's what everybody said. That was so incredibly moving and beautiful, and just when you thought you couldn't be even more moved, the ending was just tremendous, I have to say, the way that you chose to bring those voices in. We really want to allow time for your questions, so, excuse me. So we have a microphone right over here, so if you would like to come up and ask a question, please do so. Maybe to help get us started, I might start with one, which was that it seemed very much to be a film that's a portrait of an artist, but then also it's meant to tell us something about the Holocaust. And and this tragic and awful moment in history. And you chose, in a sense, not to show a lot. There were decisions to really leave it to our imaginations and to the narrative we already have in our head. Oh, sorry. So one of the questions, yeah, there you go. I'm going to blow you off the stage now. One of the questions I have is really that what kind of challenge was that to balance the story as the story of an incredible artistic talent, but at the same time tell the story of the Holocaust?
I don't think I'm telling the story of the Holocaust per se. We drew from Life or Theater, which was Charlotte's own telling of parts of her life. And in doing that first, we positioned the rise of the Nazis and that very difficult part of her life in the same way that she did, which is that there were flags, things happened, but at the same time she fell in love, she was betrayed, she made a friend, she thought about death, she thought about art. So we followed her lead, if you will.
Yeah, you can really see that. And of course, she had so much tragedy in her life and joy, and it was all sort of mixed together. And I don't know about the rest of you, but certainly one of the things I feel at this moment watching it is, we have numbers in our heads, 6 million, but each individual person has their own gift they bring to the world. And we lost those talents and those people in this tragic way. And you just feel it, in a sense, with one person's story. It's told even that much more powerfully. So I wondered also, in watching it, were there elements of her story that you just couldn't get in? I mean, everybody's life is complicated. So I wondered if there were things that, or creative choices you made of aspects of her life not to include.
In Life or Theater, she recounts more of her childhood. She quit high school when high school became difficult. She just said, I'm not going there. And she had private tutors at home. She imagined that her stepmother and her vocal teacher, the first love, were having an affair. So we made some choices.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
But there were also parts of her life that were not represented in Life or Theater. So we also drew from some biographical details.
Yeah, I meant to ask you that as well. And let me just once again invite people to come up with I don't want to dominate the conversation. I can have lots of my own questions here, but how much did you rely on historical scholarship to tell this story?
Quite a bit, and yet Charlotte died young, and there's not a lot of documentation. And she called her work Life with a question mark or Theater with a question mark, inviting us into a whole reflection on truth and representation. For instance, the first boyfriend survived the war in London and denied that they ever had a sexual relationship. So did they? Didn't they?
And isn't there a little ambiguity over whether or not she actually poisons her grandfather?
So I worked closely with the Charlotte Salomon Foundation, and as things came to light, we talked a lot about what they thought should be in her biography. There's also a very famous scholar, Professor Pollock, who's an art historian in the UK, who has spent 20 years really looking at Life or Theater, and she postulates that the grandfather was a sexual predator. And maybe there's, it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
But by the time her book came out with the foundation, we thought, well, that's really interesting, but it's not quite yet in her biography.
Sure.
But Charlotte invites that, I think, oddly.
Yeah, in terms of how she portrays him. Okay, so we have our first question here.
Hi, that was very interesting. My question's more from the artistic standpoint. I'm looking at the way you drew the characters, and it looks very much like a takeoff of Gauguin. They look very Tahitian, not very European or Jewish. And I'm wondering, is that because her art reflects that, or is that a artistic liberty that you took? How did you come about that? That's how I saw it. But
Yeah,
maybe
I've never
not.
heard that take on it, so that's interesting. For the designs of the characters, we tried to be inspired both by how she drew people and herself and photographs we had of them. So it was sort of a mix-up. But the character designer is a really talented man in Berlin, so maybe he was inspired by Gauguin. I don't know about it.
Thank you.
And I think we have another question.
Thank you for making this film. other than this evening, where can people see this movie? Is it going to be live stream? It's going to be.
It's on Hulu right now, but if you don't have the fancy subscription without commercials, then you can rent it off of iTunes, I guess, or Apple or Amazon. So you can find it online now, and it's opening in France on November the 9th, and in the UK on December the 9th. So it's sort of starting to open around the world.
So I might just follow up by asking about that ending and about that decision to sort of pull us really to these were real life people, and of course, a parent's grief and their view. How instrumental? So maybe you could tell us a little bit about the story about how the family obviously came into possession of her work. How did this actually then become disseminated in the public? And it wasn't until the early 60s, so there was actually a little bit of a lag. Was that because of lack of interest in this kind of story or the family's reticence? Can you tell us a little bit about how these actually came to be known?
Yeah, I'm not sure. What I remember is that I think the family tried to get different people interested in it, and then they finally found a curator in Amsterdam, a man who agreed to show it in the 1960s. But the whole story around the poisoning of the grandfather is that the stepmother, so at the end of Life for Theater, Charlotte didn't have a lot of time, and it's all text. Life for Theater is incredible because you have these gouache, and on top of the gouache, you have overlays, and you have suggestions for dialogue and music. But at the end, it's just text after text. And the stepmother apparently took some pages away from the collection in which she confessed to poisoning her grandfather and kept them. I think the condition was until she passed, and then it came to light.
I see.
So I think there was a bit of a possessiveness, or how do we want Charlotte to be perceived?
Right.
And I think that has continued. I think one reason we don't know enough about Charlotte Salomon is that when people like her work, they like it fiercely. And they want to hold on to Charlotte, and everyone has their own sense of Charlotte. So I think it may have been a combination of sexism. It was a woman's art, and they thought it was a diary and little drawings, and possibly the family's possessiveness.
That's interesting. Yeah, it kind of brings to mind the Anne Frank diary story a little bit too, in terms of the concern over how she was going to be represented in some editing, and then later on you were able to get the full picture here. And of course, she was so radical in her art and in her presentation. I mean, she really didn't fit a mold. I mean, and so even for an artist in any moment where you're really pushing against the boundaries, it's such a fraught experience when you're not getting accepted. People don't see what you're doing, and they don't really understand what you're doing. So I was also wondering if, in a sense, art caught up with her by the 60s, and she could kind of, in a sense, be more appreciated at that moment.
I mean, maybe. I first saw her work in the late 90s. No, I first was given her book when I was 13, but I first saw it mounted in a museum in the late 90s. And I'm not an art historian, but I think she was sort of her time as well. You can look at other expressionist work, and I think she was probably in conversation with other people who were doing similar work. It's just she went to art school at a time when that was classified as degenerate.
Definitely. All right. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yeah. Yes. Go.
To ask a question. How did you decide how to produce this? What made you have that passion to produce this?
I don't know. It's been the idea, as I said earlier, came into my head, and I've been producing films for a while, and so the idea of producing a film wasn't a new idea for me. I've been doing that for a couple of decades. So this was just an idea for a film that came into my head. And does that answer your question? That's what we tried to tell in an adult movie in this form. I was just at a festival in LA called Animation is Film, and I do think that one can tell a whole range of stories in animation.
I agree with you on that, because we see a lot of the students' artwork, and there's a kind of emotional nakedness about it, I guess you could say, sort of its rawness. They're not filtered yet. It's very direct, and you really do get that through a lot of these images as well. I think we did get some more audience members up here. Thank you so much for that. No, that was great.
Hello. My questions are of the technical nature also. Is this computer generated or is it hand drawn?
It's a combination.
It's
So it is a 2D assisted, and there are some hand-drawn sequences. Like when the grandmother tries to hang herself, that's all hand-drawn. But otherwise, there are these rigs, but a lot of the face animation is hand-drawn.
And how many animators did you have working on the project and how long did it take?
I think I've spaced this out. I think we had about 70 animators in different countries, as well as background artists. And it took about 2.5 years with COVID in there as well.
And so was your job coordinating all of the different formats and making sure that all the colorization and everything jived together?
Oh, God, no.
No.
No, I have no experience in animation. And so I worked with a wonderful woman who has 20 years of experience in animation, and she'd never done a feature. And I relied heavily on her and am very indebted to her. Animation is, they have these daily quotas, and the math of it is really interesting. I learned a lot. I was explaining earlier that animation is done, to my mind, backwards. You lock picture before you make the film. So there are all these different things that I had to learn how to deal with. And at the same time, I was working with a crew who'd never worked in mature adult storytelling. So that was interesting too, to sort of talk to people about conveying emotion and how to convey it and what a dramatic story needs that maybe a kid's comedy might not need.
Well, it's very powerful because it's this beautiful colorization and the animation is wonderful, juxtaposed with the very sad story that you're telling.
Oh, I'm glad you connected with it.
Yeah.
So I think we have one more question, and we'll make that our last question, I think, for tonight.
Hello. Thank you first off for showing it here at our school. I was just curious how your process has.
I think you're going to need to pick it up. You're
Oh,
too tall.
so sorry. I'm just curious about as a producer for a project like this. You said on a run you had the idea of trying to cover her story. Who did you approach after that? Did you go straight to writing the narrative, or did you have to go get life rights? Just a little bit of that, like. How did you obtain?
So I approached the Charlotte Salomon Foundation and optioned the paintings, which is I don't know how many films are based on a series of paintings. And then I worked with writers. I worked with writers for about 4 or 5 years. So coming from live action, I'm used to putting a lot of energy into working on the screenplay as the sort of very fixed thing, very fixed guide for the film. In animation, often the story will be made while people are doing the animatic, drawing all the storyboards. So first the rights to the paintings, then working with writers, and then everything else.
How true did this stand to your screenplay?
It's a great, the first cut of so an animatic is when you storyboard the film and then you edit it together. It's a very weird thing because different people will draw different sequences, and so the characters look and feel different, but you're trying to follow the story. And the first version of that had all of this, I was talking about this earlier as well, plussing, which is something you do in animation where you have characters walking down the street, but you want the frame to be lively, so you have someone running after a bus and they miss it. And so there are all these jokes all through it, and so we went back to the script really closely.
Thank you so much. And the final question would just be on that kind of like final image of like south of France, that beautiful image, and then you hear everything off screen. Like, was that in the screenplay to hold on that shot for like 15 seconds and just let us hear them being beaten and taken away? Or
Yes.
was that was? Okay.
Yeah, it was actually one of the first decisions we made to end it that way.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing example of what you don't see is even more powerful because of the power of your imagination and sort of, filling in what's happening.
Yeah, we wanted the audience to feel the absence of her.
Mhm.
That's really what it was about.
Mhm. Great. Well, thank you so
Thank you.
much. This has been wonderful.